I should probably stop right there. It's going to be downhill from Hugh's description of my work. I want to thank you for that extremely generous introduction. And I want to thank my colleagues in the history department who have been so welcoming. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I want to thank Woody for getting a haircut just for this occasion. And I want to talk broadly about my work and then hone in a little bit about this strange place I write about, which is the borderland shared by the United States and Canada. And you'll see that where you expect to find Ontario, it's called Upper Canada, and where you expect to find Quebec, it's called Lower Canada. And these two provinces were created in 1791 when Great Britain divided the province of Quebec, which had essentially been all of Canada up until that point. And I'm going to be speaking about the U.S. Constitution by basically working all around it and saying nothing about the Constitution itself. But to try to put the making of the Constitution in the context of its time and to broaden the context that we think about beyond the United States and to think about what's going on in North America and what's going on within the British Empire at that time. And to see that it is emerging out of the interaction with the British Empire, but also with native peoples in the interior of the continent. In recent decades, there has been a broadening out of colonial history in which we have been much more attentive to transatlantic influences from Africa and from Europe as ongoing rather than narrating the colonial period as some sort of escape from the bad old world. Now that kind of thinking is, I think, half the story, and another group of historians known as continental historians have tried to bring native peoples into the narration of early American history as essential influences. And I think you need to combine continental and Atlantic history in order to get the true big picture of what's happening in North America in the colonial period. Unfortunately, those insights have been a little slower to percolate into the period after the American Revolution, where we still write mostly very much in the national tradition. And I'm going to try to stretch beyond that national tradition today. And I want to begin with a quote from somebody who's right in the center of that national tradition, John Adams, who in 1783 was an American diplomat in London. And he reported that he wasn't getting very far in his attempts to define the American relationship with the British. This is immediately after the Revolution. This was in June of 1783, shortly after the peace treaty. And he writes, quote, "The British ministry and nation are in a very unsettled state. They find themselves in a new situation and have not digested any plan. Ireland is in a new situation. She is independent of Parliament, and the English know not how to manage her. To what an extent she will claim a right of trading with the United States is unknown. Canada, too, and Nova Scotia are in a new situation. The former, they say, must have a new government, but what form to give them, and indeed what kind of government they are capable of, or would be agreeable to them, is uncertain. The ideas of the British cabinet and merchants at present are so confused upon all these subjects that we can get them to agree to nothing," end quote. Now it's interesting how he is linking together Ireland to Canada to how they will treat the United States. These things were all connected. And I think we have to add to this mix that at the very same time, native peoples around the Great Lakes, on both sets of shores, and in the Ohio Valley were forming a confederacy. So in this era of framing constitutions, not all of them are written. And the native peoples around the Great Lakes are engaged in framing their own constitution. In the wake of the war, the native peoples had felt betrayed in a treaty which had essentially cast them, most of them, within the American border. And they had made known their unhappiness to British officers in forts around the Great Lakes, who became terrified that the native peoples would rise up and seize those forts in order to keep the British from turning them over to the Americans. In order to keep this from happening, these commanders begged their superiors in London to rethink the theory and to at least hang on to those forts. That giving up those forts and running a boundary through the middle of the Great Lakes was terrible for Canada's economy and was terrible for Canada's security, and certainly was throwing into disorder the alliance with Native peoples that was essential to Canada's security. So it's under the pressure of Native peoples that the British reframe their policy and decide they will, for the time being, hang on to those forts. They were in places, see if we can actually work this. Here we go. Detroit, nice right here, Oswego, and up here on Lake Champlain. So the new thinking among the British is that there will be a buffer zone between the British and Canada and the United States. Most of this buffer zone then will exist within a boundary that the Americans are claiming as their territory as a result of the Revolution. The Native peoples insist that the different nations that will join this confederacy, and there were dozens of nations, that none of them could individually sell land to the United States, that they would instead collectively hold their lands together. And they succeeded in doing this militarily, defeating armies sent by the United States during the 1780s and early 1790s. They were assisted in doing this by munitions provided to them from the British in their forts at Detroit and Niagara and Oswego. So the British have committed themselves then that they are engaged in a Cold War against the United States for just about a decade in support of this Indian Confederacy. And during the 1780s, the United States can do nothing about it. They have no effective military, and they do not dare take on the British forts. Throughout this, the Americans cannot recognize that ultimately it's a Native American initiative behind it. Instead, they insisted that the British had reneged on the treaty, had used the Indians as pawns, and were out to destroy the United States by limiting its expansion. And it is the case that during the 1780s, the only significant source of revenue that the United States could count on was by selling lands to its west in the Ohio Territory. So if they could not dislodge Native peoples and take over their lands, the United States is likely to starve for lack of funds. So this British alliance with Native peoples in this new confederacy is perceived to be a threat to the Union and a threat to the survival of the Republic during the 1780s. And the alternative that many Americans see, and most of them do not see it fondly, is some kind of return to a relationship with the empire, perhaps very much like the new relationship framed in Ireland in 1782. So the American Revolution doesn't simply liberate the 13 colonies into the new United States. It also calls into question the entire British Empire. And the British have to rethink what they're going to do with Ireland, which in some ways is the most important component of the empire because it is so close at hand. Ireland was 3/4 Catholic and 1/4 Protestant at that time. And the Protestants themselves were divided almost evenly between those who were Anglicans or Episcopalians and those who were dissenters, mostly Presbyterians. And in this arrangement, the Catholics were denied almost all political rights. They could not hold office, they could not own land, they could not get higher education, they could not vote. Many of these restrictions, not the one against landholding or higher education, but against office holding, also applies to dissenters, to the Presbyterians. So this is a period in Ireland's history where the Presbyterians and Catholics, many of them find common cause against the Anglican elite that governs Ireland. The Revolution had created an opening for reform that had been exploited by a group called the Volunteers. And what they did was they were Protestants mostly, and they offered to arm themselves and to come to the defense of Ireland against an anticipated French invasion during the war. But it's very clever what they've done, because now they have guns. The British need them because their army is stretched thin around the world. Most of it is engaged in the West Indies or fighting against the American Revolution. So they need somebody to defend Ireland, and these people have come to the fore with their guns, and that's good news. The bad news is they also conduct their meetings as political groupings, and they start to press the British for major reforms. And the British feel they have no choice but to give in. In 1778, they allow the Irish more freely to trade with the rest of the empire, which is an enormous economic boon. Second, in 1782, they decide to liberate Ireland's parliament, which had been subordinate to the imperial parliament in Westminster. So theoretically, Ireland has resumed as a separate kingdom, separate from Britain, which is the union of Scotland and England and Wales. This independent parliament, however, is still dominated by the Anglican quarter of the population, and the executive is still a Lord Lieutenant appointed by the Crown. And there are still 12,000 British regulars who will be posted after the Revolution in Ireland. So it is something less than half of a loaf in terms of achieving Irish independence. The original designer of this policy, Lord Shelburne, who was the Prime Minister in Britain in 1782, had intended this to be a model that would be held out to American negotiators as an alternative sort of relationship that they could have to the British Empire in lieu of being independent. Now, of course, American leaders wanted no part of this Irish model, and so they just rejected that and insisted upon independence in the peace treaty. And thereafter, the Irish are going to become very frustrated with finding out how little true autonomy they have achieved. Rather than leading to greater autonomy, the limited concessions of 1782 proved to be a reactionary firewall that consolidated the power of the Anglican elite, to the deep and growing frustration of both Presbyterian and Catholic reformers. A frustration that would lead to a major rebellion in 1798 in Ireland. Now, meanwhile, the British faced a very similar dilemma in Canada, which is also occupied and has a Catholic majority. It's a much smaller population, and it has a smaller Protestant proportion of the population. Almost everyone living in Canada in the 1780s, or excuse me, prior to the 1780s, were either native people or they were French Canadians who had been conquered in a previous war in which the British had prevailed, and which had culminated in a Treaty of Peace in 1763, awarding Canada to the Empire. Now, the British had decided, though, in Canada, or as it was then called Quebec, to adopt a very different policy than the one they will pursue in Ireland. In Ireland, they are trying to empower a Protestant minority. They decide that they cannot afford to do that in Canada. Instead, they are going to recognize the political and civil rights of the Catholic majority. And they do this in something called the Quebec Act of 1774, which establishes French law as paramount in Quebec. It also establishes the sort of government that had existed under the French colonial regime. It's one without an elected assembly. But the French Canadians had never had an elected assembly, and they don't particularly want one because they believe that the purpose of an elected assembly is to levy taxes. So they are virtually untaxed, and they do not have an elected assembly. Instead, they have a governor general appointed from London, and they have a council also appointed from London that consists of a mixture of British imperial officials and local notables known as seigneurs, who are large landholders. And this seems to be to the satisfaction of the French-Canadian majority. What it's not to the satisfaction of is the small minority of British people who had moved there, who insist that the Irish solution ought to be imposed upon Canada, that there ought to be an elected assembly, but that only Protestants should be allowed to vote for it or to serve in it, that British law ought to prevail in the province. And they insisted that all of this would compel the French Canadians to adopt British culture and become good British subjects. And so you've got this irony that the discontented people within Canada are the British people, whereas the so-called French party are the people who are the supporters of the status quo during the 1780s. Now, the French party mostly is this composite of British imperial officials who kind of like a colonial government without an elected assembly. They think, wouldn't the 13 colonies have behaved so much better if there had not been an elected assembly? Maybe this is the way to go in the future British Empire in order to keep colonies attached. So there's a way in which the French party is a little bit of a misnomer, since the most aggressive members of this party tend to be English and Scots. But it is the case that the large landholders in Quebec rather like a system which gives them so much power. And as far as we can tell, the great majority of people who are peasant farmers called habitants were at least resigned to the situation they were in and had no desire to be ruled by an elected assembly of Protestants. But, again, the American Revolution shakes things up. It sends 8,000 refugees into Canada. It sends many more into the maritime provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, but at that time they weren't considered part of Canada. So there are 8,000 that are going immediately after the Revolution. 2,000 of them settle in what will become Lower Canada, and 6,000 of them in Upper Canada, which is around Lake Ontario. And this then emboldens the so-called British party to think, well, now we've got enough Protestants in the colony to make our system work, and the British are going to have to rethink the Quebec Act. And in 1786, there is a new Governor General who arrives, a man named Lord Dorchester, who had commanded British forces in North America at the end of the American Revolution. And he is bringing along with him a man he had then met in New York, a man named William Smith, Jr. Now, Smith may be familiar to some of you in that in the resistance to British taxes, he had been a prominent patriot. But when, during the war, the Patriot majority opted for independence and an alliance with France, Smith opts out of being a patriot and leaves and goes behind British lines. And there he is a very prominent man indeed, because he's a former Chief Justice of the New York Superior Court, and he becomes a very valued political advisor to Lord Dorchester, who then brings Smith with him to Quebec, and they are going to try to jointly run this province. And Smith falls in with the British party because he very much sees things the way they do. But he has a bigger project in mind. What he wants to do is set up a model government in Canada that will work so well that it will serve as an example to the Americans to the south of what they're missing out on. From the perspective of Dorchester Smith, everything is going to hell in the United States during the 1780s, and it's only a matter of time before this republic and its union on such a large scale will collapse. Dorchester and Smith are rather conventional political thinkers who believed it is impossible to conduct a republic on a large geographic scale. And they look at what's going on in the United States in the 1780s, and they find abundant evidence to confirm their perspective. In July 1783, Smith had predicted, quote, "We are on the eve of another revolution that will lay aside the Congress and the Republican model. The change will be either to the setting up of a British model with a reunion or with a new American king. Sooner rather than later, Americans would need a king to restore order to their chaos." Within the United States, there were plenty of leading Americans who had their fears that maybe Smith and Dorchester were right, and they certainly had their fears that Dorchester and Smith were doing everything they could to push the United States into a crisis that would ruin the Union and the Republic. From New York, Edward Carrington wrote, quote, "Lord Dorchester is known to be penetrating and judicious, and the people of the United States are in the habits of thinking favorably of him. Mr. Smith, formerly of this city, is sent with his lordship in the character of a Chief Justice. He is a man of talents, well acquainted with our natural tempers and dispositions, and he quitted the country in the firm persuasion that events like these which now prevail would lead to a reunion of us with Great Britain." Now, by events like this, what does Carrington mean? He means, in particular, the rebellion associated with Captain Daniel Shays in parts of New England. Seeking relief from debts and state taxes, armed farmers had shut down the courts and resisted state troops of Massachusetts sent to suppress them. And during the winter of 1786 to 1787, it was widely believed, and probably true, that some of Shays' leading officers had visited Quebec to seek support from Dorchester. There is no evidence, however, that Dorchester extended any such aid, but this did not keep people within the United States from imagining that Dorchester must have provided such aid. And then there's also the much more abundant evidence that Dorchester was intriguing with the leaders of Kentucky and of Vermont to persuade them to leave any association with the United States. At the time, Vermont was not part of the United States, but was an independent republic. Kentucky was part of Virginia. There were people who were the leaders of both of these who were quite discontented with their situation in the United States and who were willing to flirt with British emissaries. And then finally, in early 1787, Dorchester sent his trusted aide, a man named Major George Beckwith, to New York City to gather information and to cultivate prominent supporters for a reunion with the Empire. Now, Beckwith is the perfect man to send because he had run intelligence operations for the British during the war out of New York City. And so he has a network of people that he can get in touch with once he has returned to that city in 1787. And the timing is interesting. This comes right on the heels of the suppression of Shays' Rebellion and on the eve of the Philadelphia Convention. And Beckwith is quite discriminating in who he associates with, so he associates with people who all tell him what he likes to hear, which is that Americans are fed up with a Republican form of government and are prepared to have some sort of mixed constitution that would include a king. Beckwith reported to Dorchester, quote, "At this moment there is not a gentleman in the States from New Hampshire to Georgia who does not view the present government with contempt, who is not convinced of its inefficacy, and who is not desirous of changing it for a monarchy," end quote. They had found, quote, "from experience that a republican system, however beautiful in theory, is not calculated for an extensive country," end quote. He even reported that some leading gentlemen were planning to send a delegation to London to propose that the British provide one of George III's younger sons of the House of Hanover to become the American king. Okay. Now, the important thing here isn't how much of this was really true. The matter is, this is what Beckwith believes, and this is what he has reported to Dorchester. And certainly there were people that Beckwith is talking to who lead him to believe this was true. And there certainly were a lot of people alienated with the American system of 1787, and in particular, the powerful sovereignty that the states held. In April 1787, Beckwith predicted that Congress, quote, must fall to pieces in the course of next winter and is held together now merely by the prospect of the conventions being held to do something effectual, end quote. But entirely opposed to Beckwith's prediction, in fact, of course, the convention works out, and that people, the great majority of the top leadership in the United States, does want to have, as Madison put it, a Republican solution to Republican ills. They want a stronger federal government that will be capable of raising money and of subordinating the states. And this is what they get, at least potentially. The new federal government could tax the people directly instead of begging requisitions from the states. And in sharp contrast to the previous Confederation, the new constitutional regime had a potentially powerful executive branch headed by a president who could take over the war against Indian peoples in the West. Now, all of this then induces the leadership in London to decide they've got to solve their Canada problem right away, because all of a sudden the United States looks like, at least in the short term, it's going to be a formidable competitor for predominance in North America. And so the new Secretary of State for Colonial Affairs, Lord Grenville, in 1789 announces, quote, I am persuaded that it is a point of true policy to make these concessions, meaning a colonial government for Canada, at a time when they may be received as a matter of favor, and when it is in our own power to regulate and direct the manner of applying them, rather than wait till they shall be extorted from us by a necessity, end quote. In other words, he doesn't want another revolution in North America. And he thinks that unless they provide a form of government that is pleasing to the British party as well as the French party in Canada, that there is the risk of another revolution, and if there is, then the United States will be in a position to pick up the pieces of Canada. So this is what he does, or this is what Parliament does in the Canada Act of 1791. They will divide Quebec into two provinces, Lower Canada and Upper Canada. Now the division is in part geographic. Upper Canada is called that because it is upstream. It's around the Great Lakes. Lower Canada is downstream, so we tend to think of Lower and Upper having to do with north and south. Lower Canada is actually north of Upper Canada, but it is downstream. The difference is also cultural. Lower Canada is overwhelmingly French-Canadian. It includes Quebec City, and it includes Montreal, and all the French-Canadian habitants living between those two premier towns. Upstream, Upper Canada is overwhelmingly loyalists who have settled there as refugees after the American Revolution. They are Protestants, they are English speakers. They get the same political arrangements in both colonies, but the French-Canadian Catholics are allowed to vote and hold office in their assembly, and so they will dominate that assembly. The British also decide that they're going to make major concessions. And the calculation here is that what they want to do is, on the one hand, is to make sure that the grievances, the immediate grievances that had led to the American Revolution would not be repeated in Canada. And so they promise that Parliament will never tax Canada. There will be local taxes for the benefit of the colonial governments of Upper Canada and Lower Canada, but these are very small. Parliament, however, will not be taxing them whatsoever. Second, land is virtually free it's much cheaper to get farmland in Canada under this regime than it is within the United States. They abolish all quit rents, which had been a modest grievance within the colonies. And they provide both of these colonies with an elected assembly. But they also persevere in having an appointed royal governor and an appointed upper house of the legislature known as a council. So the effort is to minimize all of those grievances that might lead to trouble, and then to starkly restrict the forum in which people could exercise some sort of electoral voice and make trouble. So the British designed the Canadian governments to restrict both popular discontent and popular participation in politics. They wanted a content and inert public by minimizing taxation and maximizing access to cheap farmland. On the other hand, they also restricted electoral power and tightly controlled the press to prevent people from stirring up trouble. Lord Thurlow explained that the British, quote, have given them more civil liberty without political liberty, end quote. So what does he mean? He means that they have the civil liberties of the common law without political participation by the common people in any sort of major way. In sum, the British worked to deny the colonists both the civil motives and the political means for rebellion. So, to wrap up, the age of the 18th century, and particularly the age of the 1780s, was an age of counter-revolutions as well as of revolutions. The Canada Constitutional Act culminated a decade of constitutional rearrangement in North America and the British Empire. Set in motion by the American Revolution, the reordering included the Indian Confederacy on the frontier, the supposed legislative sovereignty in Ireland, a new federal constitution for the United States, and the Canada Constitutional Act, which created Upper and Lower Canada. By blocking American expansion, the Indian Confederacy had threatened the Republican Union that prospered by consuming Indian land. During the 1780s, Indian victories had halted American expansion in land sales, revealing the weakness of the American Confederation. That impotence had emboldened British leaders who retained the border forts. The retention embarrassed the United States and inflicted a trade depression. In turn, the economic troubles increased social conflict, particularly Shays' rebellion, which further corroded confidence in the Confederation. Dreading what they perceived as anarchy, leading Americans began to fear, and a few apparently began to welcome, a British design to subvert the Confederation and to reintegrate the states into the empire. American nationalists, however, saw ominous precedents in the hollow legislative sovereignty granted to Ireland. They also expected the worst from the similar schemes of Lord Dorchester and William Smith to render Canada a model for regenerating a continental empire. Americans feared the devolution of their weak union into regional republics, which then would collapse into anarchy and ultimately recommend a return to the empire. Again, that's all the fear that is out there. To save their independent republic, among other goals, in 1787 to 88, American nationalists crafted and ratified a new federal constitution. In response, the British endowed the Canadian colonies with a mixed constitution meant to attract American settlers while compelling their loyalty. English-speaking North America became a house divided between American republicanism and the British mixed constitution, and between American expansionism and the resistance of an Indian Confederacy allied to the empire. Would the continent ultimately belong to an expansive republic or to a renewed British Empire allied to a confederation of native peoples? Thank you.